We now turn to panel number one. The topic for panel number one is technology and the global war on terrorism, sense-making and enabling action. Moderating the panel is Dr. Letitia Haynes from SOCOM. Providing their perspectives are a distinguished panel of experts, including Dr. Richard Aldrich from Warwick University, Dr. R.E. Burnett from NDU's College of International Security Affairs, Dr. David Wigmore from NDU's College of International Security Affairs, and Dr. Peter Roberts from the Royal United Services Institute-RUSI. Dr. Haynes, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Dr. Oakley. So once again, I'm Dr. Letitia Haynes, and I'm proud to be the moderator for the first panel of this forum. This panel represents a wide variety of scholars with both theoretical and practical experience, distinguished in science and technology, strategy and innovation, and even disruptive thinking. It was great getting to learn some of their works, and I'm appreciative in the role I play as their moderator. So without further ado, our first panelist is a professor of international security at the University of Warwick in England. His topic is SOF, Science and the Smart City. And he has a slide presentation for us as well. Please welcome Dr. Richard Aldrich. Dr. Aldrich, the floor is yours.
Well, first of all, thank you for the very kind welcome. And thank you for inviting me to speak to you today. Can I just check everybody can see me?
Yes.
Yeah, great. So welcome to my kitchen. I'm not sure whether Zoom picks up the smell of cheese. Technology is advancing all the time. But can I just say seriously, it's a huge pleasure and an honor to speak at this conference, and slightly intimidating to talk before personnel with such vast operational experience. But it's always rewarding to see academics and practitioners working together and sharing ideas, solving problems, and above all, thinking about the future. So a big thank you to Dr. Haynes for chairing this session, and a big thank you to David Oakley and all his team who put together this wonderful program. Could I ask for the first slide, please? So our subject today is technology and terrorism, and it's of the first importance. Why is this? Because technology connects us with core issues about the future of American power. Technology is a place where the United States remains a great power, indeed the great power in the world. It's why the perennially optimistic Professor Joseph Nye at Harvard insists that the United States will always remain top nation. So we need to give this subject careful attention. But it also brings challenges. Brad Smith, president of Microsoft, said recently that every company in the world must learn to think like a technology company. Going to hijack that quote a little bit. We're doing terrorism today, so hijacking is probably okay. I'm going to hijack it and modify it slightly, and I'm going to say that every company, every platoon, every squad must also learn to think like a technology company. Well, I only have 10 minutes to address this broad, complex subject, so my plan is to focus on technology and science and cities, where there is a strong tradition of SOF or SOF work. And this allows us to learn from history, which is one of the key themes of our conference. Could I have the next slide, please? So some history. Historical figures ranging from Marx to Lenin, from Carlos Marighella to the Baader Meinhof, have viewed cities as a sanctuary for the revolutionary, for the anarchist, and the terrorist. Even in the 19th century, the city and the anonymity of the crowd was seen as a security problem. And the antidote was what we now call the rise of the detective, something that was celebrated by popular fiction and typified by Sherlock Holmes. In other words, the urban police had been subjects of suspicion in the early 19th century, but by the late 19th century, detectives were becoming heroes, importantly for us, heroes of science and technology. Conan Doyle, Charles Dickens, H.G. Wells, all celebrated forensic science in the city. The message was about an urban sense maker who deployed knowledge and technology. And so there's a long historical legacy here. Could I have the next slide, please? So fast forward about 100 years, let's talk about cities in the 1980s. I would go so far as to suggest that by the 1980s, intelligence and special forces were beginning to create what some might consider to be the first smart cities. We could look at Berlin, either east or west, but the example I want to talk about more closely is Belfast in Northern Ireland and the contest with the IRA, a really formidable and technically competent organization. So the intelligence war here was not just about wiretaps or imagery, but also about early computing. Belfast as a city boasted the first vehicle tracking system linked to a computer called Vengeful. And indeed, by 1990, the security apparatus in the city had over 30 intelligence gathering computers and eventually linked to, yes, covert cameras, but also wired into local and civil unclassified systems. In other words, smart cities are not just about the future. We have some 40 years of hidden history to learn from. And what do we learn from this lesson? The importance of integrating with humble civil infrastructure. In other words, getting in on the ground floor. Next slide, please. So the IRA were wily opponents, and they were also focused on technology. And by 1990, they had actually uncovered the Vengeful computer by doing some innovative dumpster diving. And that just illustrates how keeping our systems secret when they're visible, when they're integrated with civil systems is a real challenge. And the problem of secrecy is something that I know Chris Moran is going to talk about tomorrow. In the 1990s, there were other signs that terrorists were thinking about technology and the city. The IRA shifted from political targets, typically their mortar attack on Downing Street, the Prime Minister's office. Instead, they attacked the financial centre of the City of London, causing billions in damage. And this was, in a way, a precursor to the 9/11 attack on New York. Even more indicative was the thwarted attacks, the failed attacks on London's power supply. And what this shows us is that terrorists were learning to think about a city as a networked brain, not just as a series of buildings. Very interesting. So next slide, please. Turning to Baghdad, Baghdad really illustrates some of the important lessons learned in Iraq in the first decade of the 21st century. Famously, the McChrystal approach, it takes a network to defeat a network, was highly successful. And again, it focused partly on science, speed, and digital forensics in the urban environment. Perhaps most impressive during this phase was the fusion of different skills, different arms, organizations, different ints, and the way in which they were brought together. But the experience in Baghdad, the historical experience of that first decade, also raises some important questions. Firstly, what do we do in megacities where we have less control over the environment? Secondly, what do we do when terrorists learn that technology is more their enemy than their friend, and they throw away their laptop and their mobile phone? And thirdly, did the experience in Baghdad change the nature of SOF to cause us unduly to focus on targets rather than other SOF aspects? Each of these three questions is perhaps worthy of an entire conference. Next slide, please. Well, Baghdad was just a city of 7 million people. A megacity is often defined as a city of 10 million people. By 2030, we will have 40 cities of 15 million people. And by 2050, several cities at 50 million. These are truly mind-boggling statistics. What are the challenges that accompany them? A megacity is not necessarily a smart city. More often, it's actually an unsmart city. And I would argue the less smart the city, the more attractive that city is to the terrorists. And terrorists are learning about security systems, they're learning about evasion, they're learning how to avoid sensory apparatus and computing in the city. I would say that every city is different. Every city has its own operating system. And what we need to be doing as military professionals is beginning to map these now. Indeed, I'd argue we need to go further than this. If possible, we need to be encouraging some kind of international operating standard for future city technology. In other words, like Belfast and Baghdad, we need to be in on the ground floor. Next slide, please. So in conclusion, the vision of the megacity is often focused on 2030. And in the academic literature, it's almost unremittingly gloomy. By contrast, the vision of the smart city is often focused a little further forward on 2050, and it's often portrayed as a panacea. I think neither are correct. It will be a complex mixture. But one thing is very clear. Rather like the internet, smart cities will be shaped by big technology and big corporations as much as government. I said at the start of my presentation that SOFs need to think more like technology companies, and certainly technology companies are thinking 20, 30 years ahead. But I would venture we also need to ask corporations, the corporations that build future cities, to think about the requirements of security, intelligence, and technology. Because how they wire the cities of the future will be foundational for us as practitioners. In other words, they are building our future operating environment right now. So perhaps there needs to be a conversation. Perhaps this is a discrete mission of defense diplomacy. It's an important challenge. It's a conversation about our own future. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Aldrich. Okay, and next panelist is a distinguished professor who is currently visiting faculty at, is the Dean of Faculty and Academic Programs at the College of International Security Affairs in Washington, D.C. His topic is an overview of technology and the war on terror, 9/11, the third offset, emerging science and technology. Please welcome Dr. R.E. Burnett. Dr. Burnett, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. Quick voice check. Are we good? Yes, thank you. I hear you. Great. I also want to give my thanks to everyone who put this conference together and the preceding speaker as well. Very interesting presentation. It's my hope that my comments will be quite complimentary to that as well. I do need to state that as a faculty member and a dean at the National Defense University, I'm part of the U.S. Department of Defense, and therefore my comments do not reflect any official statement of policy of the Department of Defense or the United States government. They are my own views. I'd like to open with a historical frame that I'll borrow from a chapter that I'll publish with my co-author, Carly Philpott, in a forthcoming Cambridge University book on the economics of terrorism, edited by Gunther Schulz and Atin Basu-Chartery. For nearly 2 decades, the United States has waged war that is largely focused upon the strategy, tactics, and logic of counterterrorism that was the result of the 9/11 attacks upon the homeland. This was primarily a 2-dimensional strategy. The first dimension was one of forward deployment that consisted of the wars in Afghanistan and Iraq, where the objective was to keep the terrorists out of America, to fight them in their spaces. The second dimension of the strategy was a new construct, that of homeland security, noting that our traditional home space had been attacked, successfully so in 2001, and therefore the aim was to harden the target with new schemes, tools, technologies, and powers to keep the terrorists out so that no such attack could happen again. Important is our understanding of our application of this aforementioned logic to war and terror after 9/11, that of forward deployment of American military power overseas and homeland security, the defense of the homeland, for the purpose of understanding the rapid evolution of technological capability in achieving outcomes. Furthermore, we will look more specifically at emerging science and technology as a particular area of technological innovation that stems from research and development phenomena that is tasked to provide outsized national security, specifically counterterrorism deliverables for the United States. World War II, specifically the nation's experience and the direct applications of its scientific and engineering power applied to the war effort. That, led by MIT engineer Vannevar Bush, resulted in unprecedented and extraordinary results as detailed in his report to President Franklin Roosevelt regarding the importance of science to national security and to American society in the succeeding war years. A similar experience can be seen again immediately after 9/11, when the United States began to invest heavily in research and development for both the military and homeland security spheres for science and engineering tools to affect terror and counter-terror problem sets that face the nation. What solutions might science and technology offer toward protecting American citizens from terrorism, and how can terrorism be mitigated and ultimately stopped? Importantly, in the tradition of Vannevar Bush's famous document, funding for research was widely invested across disciplines to include the physical, life, and social sciences. Prior to 9/11, Harvey Sapolsky at MIT, Eugene Goltz, and Alan Kaufman stated an important argument about the record of the role of technology in the American approach to the conduct of war. In the July-August 1999 issue of Foreign Affairs, the trio argued that American power, ascendant in its technological prowess as proven in the Gulf War, gave pause to major war on the part of international actors as a viable security instrument against the United States. In place of this was a different danger to the United States, that of asymmetric threats in the form of terrorist acts that could be designed to disrupt and sabotage U.S. infrastructure, financial and economic activity, and thereby impact its security capabilities. Consider the following logic to buttress Sapolsky's argument. For a period of time from the mid-1990s into the mid-2000 decade, the United States reached an unprecedented status, exceeding its superpower capacity and becoming the world's first hyperpower. In one measure, this was quantified by military spending on a national basis as a percentage of GDP. At its apex, the United States in approximately 2007 was spending annually on its military goods and services as a percentage of GDP, an amount that was equivalent to the combined spending, also as a percentage of GDP, an amount that was equivalent to the next 17 nations total. Major war as a legitimate foreign policy tool levied against the United States by other major powers would certainly be a very costly exercise. However, as Sapolsky argues in a complimentary article, asymmetric war against the United States conducted by terrorist groups provided them with many opportunities that were accentuated by vulnerabilities that were unique to American culture and the American way of war. Sapolsky and Shapiro's view from 1996 is a striking one indeed to set the tone for the rest of this discussion. Quote, "No one should want to fight the United States. We are the world's richest, most technologically advanced nation. We can mobilize more combat power and move it farther, faster, and sustain it longer than anyone else. Sufficiently provoked, we are very dangerous, indeed even brutal. The World War II experience suggested this. The Korean and Vietnam Wars added proof. Our vulnerabilities, such as they are, lie not in the quantity or quality of our conventional forces, nor in weapons of mass destruction. The United States cannot be out-researched, outproduced, or outgunned. Our troops are superbly equipped, brave, and well-trained. No one's forces can see more or communicate better in the fog of war than ours. We have great redundancy in nearly every aspect of our forces and economy. And as the Cold War demonstrated, not even the threat to use nuclear, biological, or chemical weapons can stop us from protecting what our leaders managed to define as our vital national interest. Rather, our vulnerabilities lie within ourselves and our society. Our strength is complemented by our good fortune. We live in a quiet part of the world surrounded by oceans and neighbors who have not the slightest thought of attacking us. As we have come to recognize both our strength and security, we have imposed constraints on ourselves. In particular, we have grown ever more sensitive about casualties, our own military casualties, opponent and neutral civilian casualties, and even enemy military casualties, and we seek to avoid them. This limits our ability to exercise the tremendous power we possess and makes us susceptible to pressures others can ignore, end quote. 5 short years later, America was devastated by the attacks in New York City, the Pentagon, and the downing of another airliner over Pennsylvania. Al-Qaeda, operating from a far-reaching global network, was, according to Sapolsky's logic, attacking the United States and its allied and partner nations using the asymmetric logic of terrorism and forcing the United States to rethink its use of military power in terms of its counterinsurgency strategy and the application of our destructive power in the light of the vulnerabilities noted above. More recently, powerful changes in science and technology in general, as applied to the defense sector, are working their way through the political economy for resource and acquisition as it pertains to both contest in irregular warfare, terrorism, and now the dominant future forces on great power competition as featured in the National Defense Strategy. Emerging science and technologies, some potentially revolutionary in terms of capabilities and effects upon weaponry and ISR applications, led to the conceptualization of the third offset by the Department of Defense. A controversial construct borrowed from the very real strategic advantage in warfare that the United States achieved as a result of its development and application of information dominance in the 1990s and 2000s. The third offset extended this logic to consider what science and specific emerging technologies would or could be developed by the United States to provide the next strategic offset for dominance in warfare against its primary rivals in the next decades. What specific discoveries and applications from artificial intelligence, robotics, hypersonics, cloud-based communications, additive manufacturing, machine-human integration, and advanced computational science and engineering could result in a decisive strategic advantage for America. But despite these advances, the picture for such dominance future is somehow murky as real. Marked technological breakthroughs are yet to be achieved, and this is combined with the fact that the United States lead in many of these areas is not as great as it once was, where China and Russia are now making strides to level the playing field. Dominance in any of these fields appears less likely as a function of investment in new R&D schemes that have been implemented by the major competitors. This has the corresponding effect of flattening out the outsized trajectory of superiority that used to be enjoyed by the United States. As technology becomes more widely available to consumers, terrorists attempt to find ways to adapt and implement emerging technologies to gain an advantage in an asymmetric environment. This has been observed throughout modern international terrorism, which Rappaport defines in his 4 ways of modern terrorism theory as beginning around the 1890s with the anarchist movement. The evolution of modern terrorism continues to be inextricably interconnected and intertwined with technological advances. As those advances today accelerate at an unprecedented rate, it is important to consider the strategic implications of emerging technologies for counterterrorism. We focus on 3 categories of technology as they relate to counterterrorism: big data and artificial intelligence, the integration of unmanned aerial systems into 5G networks, and biosecurity. Big data and AI are interdependent and together represent a growing national security concern due to their convergence on social media. This was evident in the insurrection that took place on January 6th at the US Capitol, an event which we believe represents the tip of the iceberg for a compounding security problem in regard to terrorism due to the ability of big data and AI to radicalize individuals and prompt greater social movements. Colloquially referred to as polarization within the United States, big data and AI are major contributors in creating and reinforcing radicalized ideologies that undermine legitimacy. Big data and AI make it much easier to carry out strategic information operations, raising concern about the potential for terrorist organizations to influence the information space on a greater level than was previously available to non-state organizations. In recent years, terrorist organizations such as the Islamic State have implemented significant social media campaigns on platforms such as Twitter and Telegram to recruit, radicalize, and coordinate attacks. Online social platforms are playing an increasingly important role in the radicalization process of US extremists, and lone actors were found to be particularly active on social media. A research study by the National Consortium for the Study of Terrorism and Response to Terrorism also found evidence to suggest that social media has contributed to the acceleration of the radicalization of US extremists. When social media first emerged as a factor of radicalization in 2005, radicalization took approximately 18 months. That timeline reduced to 13 months by 2016, and it is assessed to continue to decrease as algorithms accelerate consensus on radical viewpoints. The concern regarding the technology is twofold. First, the amount and type of data that is being collected on individuals, and second, the recommendations that artificial intelligence systems are making based on that data. Within the United States, one of the strategic challenges we face regarding big data and AI is creating a solution that also balances privacy, civil rights, and civil liberties. In the European Union, the General Data Protection Regulation was created to address privacy concerns surrounding the collection of data and the use of algorithms. In contrast, the United States is behind in implementing the same level of standards for these technologies. Given the real-world outcomes of these algorithms, pursuing additional data regulation is one option for strategic counterterrorism policy. Unmanned aerial systems are also an example of a technology that terrorists found ways to adapt in an asymmetric conflict as they become more accessible with commercial off-the-shelf variants. In thinking about applications of this technology in 2021, the integration of drones into 5G networks raises concerns from a strategic counterterrorism perspective. While from a commercial perspective, integrating UAS into 5G networks will improve airspace safety. It also advances capabilities in a way that could be exploited by terrorists in the future. The ultra-low latency of 5G will allow UAS to engage in data collection and transmission at unprecedented speeds, enabling real-time analysis. Additionally, integration with 5G will provide comprehensive, high-quality, and secure connectivity that enables cost-effective drone operation beyond the line of sight, further extending the range of future UAS attacks. This will enable UAS to move across cells without the need for long and complicated reconnection protocols, meaning that a drone flying to a distant location won't have to halt every time it crosses into a new network area covered by a different mast. As UAS technology moves in this direction, it presents an opportunity to engage with the private sector to address counterterrorism concerns and reduce vulnerabilities. Lastly, rapid advancements in biotechnology research call for renewed focus on this category of weapons of mass destruction, especially amidst the profound global impact of the coronavirus disease 2019 pandemic. While scientific evidence does not support that COVID-19 was created in the lab, the widespread economic and sociological impact of COVID-19 has likely impacted biological warfare norms as biotechnology rapidly advances in the 21st century. Like other WMDs, there are longstanding international norms against the use of biological weapons. However, norms are dynamic expectations which exist at multiple levels and apply to different actors. They are not set constraints, individual events, shocks, or trauma, and apply to different actors. Of a certain magnitude, they hold potential to trigger norm changes in armed control regimes. We argue that COVID-19 challenged a key underlying assumption of biological warfare norms, and this has impact to soft communities as well as general armed conflict, the lack of military utility. Preceding the Biological Weapons Convention, the United States played a key role in strengthening the norm against biological warfare. In 1969, the United States renounced the use of biological weapons and ended its offensive BW program. Mazanek argues that the United States realized it was vulnerable to BW attacks and saw the potential for weaker states to exploit that vulnerability. Thus, from a realist perspective, the United States hoped by strengthening the norm against BW that it could persuade other states to abandon their programs as well. In Pathogens as Weapons, Koblenz highlights that the United States did not believe it needed these weapons given its conventional and nuclear superiority, and therefore strengthened this norm as a defense strategy. In 21st century perspectives on BW Convention, Cross and Klotz build upon the idea and argue that almost all countries accept Biological Weapons Convention and its norm due to the widespread belief that biological weapons have no military utility compared to other forms of conventional weapons and WMDs. However, we argue that COVID-19 undermined this longstanding assumption, particularly in the eyes of a rogue state or terrorist. COVID-19 showed that the profound global impact a biological agent can have against a conventionally superior state, such as the United States. This has been a quick overview of the role of technology in terrorism strategy and operations over 2 decades, with recent emphasis upon newer technologies and their impacts for a variety of communities. I thank you for this opportunity to discuss this with you today. I look forward to the dialogue that ensues.
Thank you, Dr. Burnett. Our next panelist is a distinguished professor who is currently visiting faculty at the National Defense University in Washington, D.C. His topic highlights the journey of his seemingly obscure intelligence community product, which later proved to have far-reaching effects. Please welcome Professor David Wigmore. Professor Wigmore, the floor is yours.
Thanks, Dr. T, and hello, Dr. Oakley, former colleague. I'm hardly distinguished, but it is a great pleasure to be here. Thanks to the others in Tampa and to my fellow panelists. My topic is going to touch on some things that were already said previously in the plenary and then by the previous speakers, particularly that wins ideally are left of boom. I'm going to touch on disruptive thinking, something that Dr. Burnett said about deploying knowledge and technology, fusion of different skills, keeping the terrorists out of America, and hardening the target. And a couple things I'd like you to think about before I begin are, how to define a foreign terrorist fighter? Is that only someone who's actually traveled abroad, or could that be someone who's considering traveling abroad? And then what do you do to prevent that travel? Just think about that. So today I'm going to tell a story. It's a true story. And it started in about 2003. And it's about a program called Kingfisher, based on the bird that sees and dives beneath the surface to catch its prey. Next slide, please. So you probably didn't expect this, but I don't know if you remember the 1983 movie Flashdance, or even if you want to or don't. But the theme song, this line just keeps coming back to me. First, when there's nothing but a slow-blowing dream. This was a dream of mine to kind of eventually start this program, and it took a long time to come to fruition. And here's the story. Next slide. So it started when I was a State Department assignee at the National Terrorism Center and its predecessor. At CIA headquarters. I had a specific job, but in the course of it, I noticed what I thought might be a pattern of sorts. By the way, as a State Department assignee at CIA, I used to joke that I was state with CIA cover that garnered a few laughs. So in essence, our job and the program that I ran there, or the office that I ran, was to extract information from classified reporting and push it down to operators. And those could be people at ports of entry in the United States. It could be to military operators abroad who might be encountering bad guys on the battlefield. But the idea was to extract identifiers from classified reporting and push it down. Now, as we know at 9/11, we were doing that, but we weren't passing it to enough screening opportunities. You'll recall that 2 of the 9/11 hijackers at least were stopped by police shortly before 9/11, and that didn't trigger kind of an alarm. We've remedied that, but at the time it wasn't the case. So to me, it appeared as if some of the people whose, let's say, applications I was looking at may have been being issued a benefit. I'm not going to be specific, despite listing concerning information on their applications beyond what was checked. And this was something I kind of noticed anecdotally, but couldn't prove yet and really didn't research in volume. So later on, I was able to test this theory with the help of supercomputing. We're talking about kind of leveraging technology to meet mission need and even get ahead of mission need. So the result was a printout that looked like a phone book, and literally probably blood, sweat, and tears are all in that phone book, including spilled coffee. There was something like 12 million applications over the years for this benefit, and over 2.5 years, that's the period we chose. And we found, well, I'm just going to say in the 3 digits out of 12 million matches of very concerning information that wasn't being checked as part of the review process. So some said, oh, only a few hundred, perhaps less than that out of 12 million, that's nothing. But then we looked at some of these people and they were very scary, and it showed a nexus to terrorism that was not being identified previously. So next slide, please. Now, I'm working in kind of a watch listing operational support role, and now work terrorist travel on the analytics side of the house. So we wrote papers as I went from that one job to the next job. And of course, types of analysis, descriptive, predictive, prescriptive. Our tradecraft does not allow us to be policy prescriptive, but we can be, and see the word I crossed out, enterprising, meaning we can do what's called opportunity analysis for our customers, cabinet, and the president. Basically saying, if we do X, we might get Y as an outcome. That's our way kind of to sneak around being prescriptive. So next slide, please. I wrote a 1-page opportunity analytic paper, 1 page. It did not meet the threshold for the president's daily brief, which in my world, means you're not good enough. It barely made it into a publication 1 level down. But nevertheless, it got carried into the Oval Office, and I'm eternally grateful to a former national security executive for that. Luck plays into my story too. Next slide. So the same day, President asked, can we do this in real time? So he read that paper. That didn't make PDB, barely made the next level down. And through my chain, I answered yes. Actually, I didn't know that that was the true answer, but I thought it was the answer he wanted, so that's what I answered. Took a risk, and then I went on vacation. Next slide, that was already planned. On the drive home a week and a half later, my boss called. He said, the reaction around town has been chaos, wear a suit to work tomorrow. So I was going to the White House. This led to another call with my supercomputing colleagues and a very big ask saying, all right, guys, can we scale this up from research to doing this on a weekly basis, perhaps? And they answered yes, and I think they meant it. So I work for as I mentioned, the National Counterterrorism Center, and no longer I'm with state, I'm with the Director of National Intelligence. And by the way, these views are my own, as you might imagine. But I like to say, especially in the early days of the ODNI and NCTC, that we didn't own anything. So we could act like we owned everything. And I'm not talking about personally identifiable information, I'm talking about technology. And by own everything, I mean everything across the IC. We could kind of pretend it was ours and theorize about using it, even though we didn't own it. It was kind of a nice position to be in. Next slide. So the takeaways were that this program that grew out of this married mission need with existing technology. In other words, the idea was to prevent, as R.E. Burnett mentioned, to keep the terrorists out of America. And how can we do that better and smarter? The technology improved actually support the mission and expand the potential. So, this kind of was a catalyst to growing the technology based on mission need and in anticipation of further mission needs, including more kinetic mission needs. Remember, we're screening, but there are other things you might do with a known or suspected terrorist. So the president, or rather the principals, came back and said, okay, it's now a permanent program and we're going to expand it, but they didn't fund it. The money followed, which is a good thing because supercomputing power is expensive. And I would argue that this demonstrated the risk of, or rather the value of risk taking versus being too risk averse. There was an argument among my superiors in one very uncomfortable meeting for me, where one said, this isn't how government works. You can't go bottom up. This has to come from the top down. And another colleague who, both very esteemed people whom I respect enormously, said, well, we're going to do it anyway. And I felt awkward because I used to work for the other guy and admired him enormously as well. And it also showed how, at least with the right champion, policies can start from the bottom up or the top down. This one started from the bottom up and then was approved from the top down. Next slide, please. So further takeaways. Basically what we did was we identified and communicated through a kind of a traditional analytic piece, a paper, an opportunity. And then did the OD&I thing, if you will, of integrating this community, basically leveraging its resources to meet mission needs across, in this case, you could argue the Homeland Security spectrum, but beyond that. This, by the way, might not have happened without an early version of IC Joint Duty, which is kind of based on Goldwater-Nichols and mirrors the military's joint duty. The intelligence community has it now as well, where I was a State Department assignee at then CIA headquarters, and then later actually at DHS, much later. It also required homework and luck. So remember that song that I mentioned earlier. It kind of started with a dream. The use cases mushroomed. And it also showed potential in the context of another scenario. In other words, the kinetic one on the battlefield. Remember, we are pushing highly classified information. We're extracting identifiers from highly classified information and pushing it to warfighters, operators, border screeners. And the use cases mushroomed. And the outcomes oftentimes were not just denying a benefit or stopping someone at the border or keeping someone off an airplane based on kind of derogatory information on their application that was not previously detected. It also resulted in other outcomes that the SOF community can imagine. All right, next slide, please. So in conclusion, we identified the mission imperative, which was, in our case, protecting life, liberty, and US interests broadly. We found champions. We did it through a paper presented for policymakers that barely made it past a couple thresholds. We theorized, we tested, we deployed, and somewhere in there we gained permission. We also made promises that maybe we couldn't keep, which I don't necessarily recommend, but we lucked out. And the bottom line was we did more with what we already had. And to R.E. Burnett's comments on kind of superior U.S. technology, boy, did we leverage that, because we could do some scary things very quickly with the supercomputers. And then we reached out and we partnered. And the money may follow if you do something similar. It may not, but in our case, it did. So with that, I will conclude. Again, it's been a pleasure, and I look forward to questions later. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Professor Wigmore. Our final panelist is the Director of Military Sciences at the Royal United Services Institute in England. His topic will be ancient Greek mythology. Please welcome Dr. Peter Roberts. Dr. Roberts, the floor is yours.
Hey, thanks, Dr. T. Listen, the core of my remarks today center on Achilles and Odysseus, two Greek warriors that much of our fascination of war is drawn from. Achilles, the demigod of warrior, Odysseus, the strategic and operational magician. In modern interpretations, both have a twist of liberal idealism in their actions, but this is not how they were originally conceived. Achilles slayed champions, princes and kings, sure, but he also murdered women and children. Odysseus won wars and yet was known for throwing babies against brick walls. But what might either of these have to do with technology and special forces? Well, listen, indulge me for a couple of minutes and see what you make of it at the end. But I will be offering an alternative view, one that I dare say will win me few friends and certainly no research funding these days. I deal in the realities of conflict, of your hard-won evidence, as well as in ancient historical teaching. This examination is far from the so-called helpful techno novels of pulp fictionists or the brilliance of political scientists and international relations gurus. Their efforts to illuminate the future of war as a known quantity based on technology and science's progression as a linear curve has not been limited to conventional forces either. They, like many, have been fascinated with the idea that technology will provide the answer to every Western Marshall problem. So we can follow the great starting speech. We can think of SOF and SF that have been at the core of US military interventions since JFK, which grew and adapted under LBJ. It was Rumsfeld in one of his earlier tours of the Pentagon who turned the irregular warfare cadre towards terrorism, following a series of murders and kidnappings of US ambassadors, diplomats, soldiers and citizens. All of these incidents took place in an arc from Somalia through Saudi to Iran. It's familiar, right? It started perhaps in Kabul in '79 with the death of US Ambassador Spike Dubs. That shift from irregular warfare to CT became institutionalized post 9/11. The focus that became strike missions of manhunt, think hunt, of capture-kill missions, underpinned by a doctrine of raiding in darkness, where speed, surprise, and superior firepower would overcome mass and defensive positions of adversaries. One might consider that missions became almost a scientific calculation of variables. And whilst technology played a role, I do wonder, rather like the previous SOCOM commander, Admiral Olson, whether we've overemphasized the importance and significance of it. In talking about SOF as a thin sliced 4 ages of US experience alone, we're ignoring the most critical aspect of military operations. This is not about politics, about politicians, about leaders or weapons. It's not about science and technology. A lot of this is about adversaries. And that history and our collective experience of SOF is much longer, wider, and deeper than simply the US version of post-Wild Bill, a hero whose ownership is disputed by your friends in Langley. That leads me to the exam question we were presented with for this panel, and it places me in a precarious position of diverging from the views of the other august speakers on this panel. In fact, I'm rather skeptical as whether technology has helped the operational environment in a helpful way or instead has actually been a rather unhelpful distraction. There's no doubt that new devices have changed the way that you've planned and fought tactically, but we seem not to have had greater success because of it. Doubling down on new technology, the ubiquitous answer to be found pretty much in every military or policy publication, seems to be a rather peculiar course of action, particularly when adversaries have already produced equipment to bypass much of what we're investing in. The same is true of intelligence, right? The two shop is expected to produce certainty in a way that is abstracted from reality. Attribution for attacks to a level that is not required to prosecute someone for a domestic murder charge. Never has so much been asked from the intel community and so much invested. The two shop has in turn promised to deliver the goods, but the reality is harder to bear. They haven't delivered accurately or cost effectively. Their increasing reliance on technology for insight and intelligence has only ever been one part of the puzzle. The other constituent parts have become less clear since 2001. Our cumulative intel is weaker than it has ever been because of our dependence on what is now placed on technical means of development, collection, and fusion. Where others see the strength of dependencies on these approaches, I see weaknesses and vulnerabilities. Thus, I cannot, hand on heart, agree with my fellow panelists and evangelize for technology or intelligence as being as useful, as important, or as decisive as many people continue to make out. Sprinkling some pixie dust of words over the top of could have, would have, or will have cannot make up for our failings as a national security ecosystem. It won't enable us to overcome the impossible tasks we're setting for industry, the scientists, or the innovators. Give me inventors, sure, but there are few enough around of them anymore. Instead, We've made our operators dependent on technology, on connectivity, and who thrive on the arena of working with certainties, not with the chaos of battle. We spent 20 years developing a special forces ethos to become the digital Achilles, Uber warriors, enabled with a supposed all-seeing eye, perfect situational awareness, beautiful weapons, infallible intel, capable of severing the heads of reptiles that decapitate adversaries, thus making their organizations, regimes, and ideologies collapse. This wasn't adaptation to a changing character of war, far from it. This was a specialization of forces for a type of fight that we told politicians we could and should prosecute, and for a type of warfare we wanted to fight, not one that was enemy-centric. It's so far from what the founders of SOF and SF intended and that knew was useful. And it's also very far from the truth of what we've achieved, right? Over history of conflict, experience and evidence tells that SOF and its forebears have found most success not as Achilles, but as the alternative Greek hero Odysseus, the cunning, conniving, cheating scoundrel who relied on his mind, lies, wit, and instinct to turn the course of campaigns where Achilles had proved unsuccessful. Think on the sacking of Troy, a true competition of great powers, the coalition of Greek city-states and islands armies fighting a massive expeditionary campaign together under a single cause against the mass of Troy, a people on the defensive, but whose own modernization and mastery of the technology of the day made them a peer competitor. The Trojan War was described in detail by Homer in the epic poem, the Iliad, a generational battle that lasted more than a decade and whose imagery has survived more than 2,500 years. Achilles and his Myrmidons were the SOF of the day, the best warriors the world had ever seen, trained for nothing but high-tempo action, the waging of death and destruction with biblical effectiveness, efficiency, and lethality. Their mastery of dismounted close combat, ambush, open warfare, maneuver, movement, and concealment gave them no equals. And yet they failed. By contrast, the campaign was won by the guile and wit of Odysseus, the king of Ithaca, a small and insignificant island with no ancestral mastery of warfare. Not just with his wooden horse, but with his deception campaign and the exploitation of the best of allied strengths, Odysseus was able to steer the Greek leadership under Agamemnon to victory. Most of his adventures and those afterwards recorded by Homer in the Odyssey. It was such a mindset that proved useful, decisive even, when used as part of a coherent campaign design in previous contests between great powers. Today, we might equip an Odysseus with technology, maybe, but it will be in the mind that decides the outcome of future interventions and engagements. And that's because the promised advances in science rarely appear, certainly not on time or on budget. Very occasionally, they live up to performance expectations and have mostly been countered, bypassed, or superseded by the time they arrive. And then, of course, today we're seeing the great democratization of advanced weapons and capabilities that mean even an advantage in AI will meet another super AI-equipped adversary within a decade. And of course, advantage in these technologies may be achieved, but it'll be fleeting because parity in technology is a fact of life and of science. Real technological advantage, if it's ever found, does not persist because war, that operation we're engaged in, is a reciprocal dynamic with adversaries, not with science. Everything is a variable and little is fixed enough to be certain. Rather than invest, therefore, in huge amounts of technology, data processing, drones, AI, cyber, or satellites, all of which can be undone by current kinetic or EW weapons, I'd rather the money was invested in the minds of the people. We need to set a course that develops a different kind of soft cadre, not one that perpetuates a myth that will solve every kind of problem. It won't and it can't. That kind of message only comes from snake oil salesmen. I'm less convinced we need those or as much snake eating in the coming wars. In future, the value of SOF will be in snake charmers. I sincerely believe that you all are going to need to emulate Odysseus to survive on the future battlefields, let alone win it. Dr. T, back to you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Roberts. Very interesting discussion there. So we do have questions from the audience. We have a few. I'm going to start with the first one that came in, and I believe it may have been for Dr. Burnett, but it says, if we can be so successful at radicalizing our own populace, is a less sophisticated population more or less susceptible to big data and AI? Dr. Burnett, can you respond?
Yeah, thanks for that question. Certainly so. I think that's the lesson of what we see with regard to these technologies that are being deployed and the empirical evidence that I spoke to in my comments earlier. We certainly have to look at this. And to the last speaker's comment about the democratization of these technologies, that's certainly a factor that will impact us going forward. Over.
Thank you. Our next question is for Professor Wigmore. Did your paper reference predictive analysis, IDing bad actors left of bang?
Yes, it did. Yes, it did. A number of them. Those were the so-called matches between, let's just say, travel applications and derogatory data. So we did reference specific instances where individuals were issued a travel benefit, I'm not going to be more specific than that, to the United States, despite listing very derogatory information on their applications. So yes, it did reference that, and it said as long as we keep screening the way we screen, we're going to get more of this. So that was the predictive part. And some of the people we detected going forward were indeed very bad actors who had otherwise evaded our previous screening regimen. So, you know, not only did we predict it, but the evidence showed that we were right. And I know that might sound like we were, you know, driving toward that, but that was in fact, and we had detractors who said, well, you know, you had some false alarms too. Yes, but we had some very bad actors also. I'm not going to talk in this forum about that, but you know, you can't count attacks that didn't occur necessarily, but I think there were some consequential catches, and we referenced, you know, we predicted that, and indeed proved true. Over.
Thank you. My next question is for Dr. Aldrich. You spoke about the need for a dialogue between military and corporations on future city design. But what did we do about the corporations that don't want, or what do we do about the corporations that don't want to cooperate? Why should they talk to us?
Well, thank you for that question. I think it's a great question. And I suppose thinking about that, I'd kind of draw an analogy between the city space and cyberspace. We've got used to thinking about technology as something that's just provided to us by suppliers. But as we look at who owns the internet, increasingly the big techs actually own the battlefield. So you've got the problem that, you know, a United States government agency might want to do something in the Middle East or in East Asia tomorrow. But maybe Brad Smith or Jeff Bezos says, no, actually, that's not happening today. I use my veto card. And I wonder whether there isn't a similar analogy with the city space. It's not just about technology supplying weapons and capability. It's about them actually shaping and owning the battle space to some degree. So I think that is actually a problem. But at the same time, these corporations accept that security is important. Security is increasingly defined in broad terms that they understand. You know, a number of speakers have alluded to these wider security challenges, climate, weather, flooding. We have the language to conduct the diplomacy of persuasion with these corporations. But I do think it's a defined mission, because the corporations are not just suppliers of technology here, they're actually shaping the space in which we'll be fighting in coming decades. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you. My next question is for the panel, and it's in regards to Dr. Peters' comments. or Dr. Roberts' comments, I apologize. He made some very interesting position and challenges about technology. And I just wanted to open the floor to the others if they wanted to challenge some of what he said about, you know, the promises that don't necessarily meet our needs when it comes to trying to get the technology inserted. So my other three panelists, do you have anything that you want to say with regards to that?
Yeah, I'll come in and speak to that. I think too oftentimes, perhaps these kinds of conversations go to the extreme positions, that it's sort of one or the other. And I don't think that's the case. I do take Dr. Roberts' comments well, and it causes us to provide greater clarity to what we're talking about. I think one of the values of studying the impact of technology, science and technology, to the conduct of war, both at the macro level and more micro levels, is that it's very important to us in terms of it advancing our ways of thinking, no matter how it turns out. But one of the things that I would raise that I think that is very important for us to think about here is, you know, where he's pointing out the failures of this is that cognitive aspect of advancing our thinking in terms of expanding the possibility of advances is very important. One of the projects that I'm involved in working with my client USASOC at Fort Bragg is in the realm of what Dr. Roberts talked about, of the original mission of the Green Berets. We're working on a program there that we're loosely referring to as the Cognitive Soldier, going back to what the original mission said is, right? In terms of their focus on language and cultural awareness and capabilities, not the kinetic aspect that Hollywood has associated them with so much, right? And that's a very important evolution in terms of where we're going and what they can really provide going forward with regard to the SF community there. I think that's very important. Certain technologies are really important in terms of empowering and making able them to do those kinds of missions. And new technologies will extend those capabilities. They will not be the ultimate solution, but they are very important in terms of human technology symbiosis, I think, in terms of achieving those missions with regard to future problem sets. Over.
Thank you very much, Dr. Burnett. And Dr. Roberts, did you want to add anything?
Yeah, I think what's really fascinating to me is, you know, it's a great panel because no one really dived into the false promises of what would be delivered. And usually when you hear these panels, everyone's banging on about, you know, how fusion, remote OSINT will suddenly provide you with a beautiful solution. And I think that's a lovely point for technologists to make. But I don't think we can live in that world. I mean, this is about the utility of SOF, right? So if we look at recent conflicts and what's going to be delivered in the next 10 years, what we guarantee to be delivered in the next 10 years as something that is really going to solve problems. None of what we've seen is a silver bullet that's going to solve these problems. It's still going to require people to go in and make hard decisions. This idea that there's going to be a ubiquitous surveillance within cities, for example, that gives you perfect situational awareness is just pixie dust. It's mythology. It's a terrible thing, and it weakens our mind. Even when we look at the lessons that we're drawing from places like Shusha, the city of Shusha during the Nagorno-Karabakh war, you know, we're talking about technology and drones as they were used there. We talk about the Israeli-Gaza conflict, and we talk about, you know, very lazily termed AI in redirecting service to air missile batteries of Iron Dome. Those weren't the real lessons. And our minds are getting weakened by this obsession with technology. The real lessons there were about fighting in cities, about the reality of what was required from SOF, of making, you know, 3 teams of 100 people, making an impossible climb in darkness to then take over a city, 300 people to take over a city that unpicked the campaign overnight. It was about SF mapping and using and working in subterranean warfare in a very different environment than anything that we've trained for, apart from a few very small groups in either Israel or perhaps in Gibraltar. You know, we just are looking at the wrong answers, and our obsession with technology, this laziness to me in our policy documents that says technology is the way that we need to go, it is really frightening that we should be promising operators in the next 10 years that this is their future, because I don't think it is. And I think that you know, the importance of growing the operators' minds and expanding them to thrive in the chaos of the battle, to use their wit and cunning, has got to be an equal or greater part than technology in this conversation.
Thank you for your comments. We do have 2 more questions from the audience. We have about 11 minutes left, so I want to get to those. I believe this first one may be going to Professor Wigmore. The role of quantum computing as a space-like technological battle between nation states. Is this an issue for GPC? For great power competition?
Probably. Yeah, I mean, I have the luxury and also the kind of downside of looking at the more immediate in my job. I mean, certainly we're looking at GPC, but I don't think anything's a panacea. I think should we be driving, you know, technology to be at parity? Certainly, but I'm probably not really qualified to answer. I live more in a world where I'm trying to do what I can to serve the mission with what we have today, rather than the promise of tomorrow that may or may not come true. So the short answer is probably, and you know, I hope that we don't fall behind, but you know, I can't say whether it's going to be decisive enough. I think it does take cunning, and I think it does take, you know, ingenuity, and you know, we can't just hand it over to technology. Over.
Okay. All right. Thank you. Our next question is for Dr. Roberts from the audience. It's, would you instead recommend potential future force options be based on purpose with tech and support rather than the opposite?
Yeah, so there's this great, you know, yet another trinity of, you know, ideas, people, and kit, isn't there? And everyone, you know, wants you to prioritize one over the other. I don't put people first, right? I put ideas first, because you know, the reality is we're about fighting. It's about death and destruction. People die, you know, people get injured. That's reality. People cannot be the first part. Ideas have got to be the first part. It's got to be about how you are going to fight, how you're going to defeat a particular adversary. So for me, when you start with the ideas and then you marry in the people, which is the one key dynamic that you can change, then you go to people to invent stuff. I mean, this is a very dated idea. You'd have to go back to the 80s to find this attractive, because it's hugely expensive. This is the point at which you're after invention. This is not like a technology company. This is not like people who go out to innovate, who can afford to fail. This is about particular tools that you need developed to serve your aim, to meet your idea, to defeat an adversary. Because the difference between military units and SOF in particular versus technology companies is, if technology companies fail, they go bust and they go and have to look for another job. If SOF fail, then people die. You know, I do not adhere to the view that we can think like businesses. We have thought about the military as a business for far too long. We are not like a business. We're totally different. No other business takes death and destruction as seriously or as a mandated purpose as the armed forces. We need to really shift the whole policy argument away from this idea that business can drive the future of our answers.
Thank you, Dr. Roberts. I have a question, a general question for everyone on the panel as we close in on the last few minutes. And that is, how will the use of technology be different in the strategic competition environment as compared to the GWOT environment? And I'll start with Dr. Aldrich, please.
Well, thank you. I think that's a great question, and obviously it's going to be more strategic, and it comes back to some of the things I was talking about with kind of Joseph Nye, and making the claim that big tech is going to keep the United States at the top of the world leaderboard, as it were, in terms of being a great power. So to some extent, maybe if we had Joseph Nye here, he might be scratching his ears a little bit about some of the things that Dr. Roberts has been saying. I found Dr. Roberts' paper fascinating, particularly compelling in this regard because of his anxieties about being surged towards more kinetic missions, moving away from some of the traditional SOF missions. But I guess with this question and also some of Dr. Roberts' assertions, I think there's kind of an assumption that we can step away from technology. There's our space, and then there's kind of cyberspace. I'm slightly resistant to these ideas. I think we're moving into a world where technology is so part of our everyday experience. It's all around us. Increasingly, it's even going to be inside us as human beings that I'm not quite sure there's going to be that kind of Cartesian ability to step away from technology. I'm emotionally attracted by it, but in practical terms, I think technology is going to be with us, both in terms of GWOT and also in terms of that wider strategic competition.
Thank you. And we do have another question I want to squeeze in from the audience before we go back to someone else on the panel. And the question may be for Dr. Roberts again. It says, define defeat in the terminology defeat an adversary.
That's just Clausewitzian, right? I mean, it's, to achieve the political ends. I think how we term it in the West is quite interesting. We have massaged it into a very liberal mindset of what defeat looks like, to bend their will to ours. And perhaps you go back through history to find other examples of perhaps instead of thinking about the cognitive defeat of an adversary, that actually we might be thinking more about the attritional defeat of an adversary, of wearing them down. You'll see a lot of the really pushing parts of military intellect at the moment are thinking about moving from this idea of just sort of maneuver warfare to decapitate and remove them as a threat, that we move to something different that goes back to a older, slightly more unpleasant age, where we're thinking about attritionally destroying an adversary, to removing their ability to fight, to really cutting the legs from them, cutting the not just the fingers from the bowmen, but breaking their bows. I think when we go back to this contest that we're now having, we need to acknowledge that there is, Jim Mattis said it, there's no preordained right to victory. There's no preordained right to technological superiority either. That actually we are going to have to shift our mindsets considerably from what has been a luxurious position that we've been in against the non-peer adversaries we've been fighting for 20 years and still not doing too well.
Okay, thank you for that. And I think I will leave the same question for Dr. Burnett, and you can probably end us, but also, how do you define defeat and defeat an adversary?
Well, I was actually prepared to pick up on Dr. Aldrich's comments about technology at the strategic level. First, I would say I'm in general agreement with what Dr. Roberts said. I teach Clausewitz as well, and I think that pretty much sums up the classic Western approaches to the notion of defeat. But if I may, let me just come back to that idea of technology at the strategic level for a moment.
Please do.
I think we have to recognize that there's a natural tendency for us to adopt increasing levels of technology at the strategic level. First, there is sort of a cost-benefit analysis that explains that. There is the natural tendency for it to fit in and actually add value at that level. I think there's some danger with this as well, though. I will point out that where you see an increase an increasing relevance for autonomous systems, AI, not the same thing, but related to matters of applications with regard to the deployment and potential utilization of nuclear weapons. A very important RAND study was done on this a few years ago with regard to the potential dangers of increased speed in decision-making by autonomous systems there. You can see the attractiveness to this. You can also see the corresponding danger to this. But if we would just look at the corresponding analogy of how we deploy, for example, autopilot in airplanes, the whole point there is to reduce the cognitive load on the human. And there's a natural attraction to that in a variety of systems, all the way down to levels of automation as opposed to autonomy. So I think we'll increasingly see the integration of this at the strategic level. But I think we have to do the hard thinking about what the cost benefit of this is as we go forward. Over.
Thank you. So this concludes panel one's discussions. I was very pleased to have been the moderator and listen in on everyone's discussion, great points. And I could see the passion and a lot of what you had to say. And I, on behalf of JSOU, thank you for being our first panel. And I will hand this over back to Dr. Dave Oakley.
Hey, thanks, Dr. Haynes and the panelists for a fantastic panel that is a great start to what's going to be a great 2 days of the forum. This brings our session on technology and GWOT to a close. Thanks again to our panelists for their comments and perspectives.